Okay, so you sent over these articles about um, a proposed law in Mississippi. Uh, the Contraception Begins at Erection Act. I mean, seriously, who comes up with these names?
Well, you got to admit it's catchy. It
Yeah.
definitely got people's attention. And, for something that's pretty obviously satirical, it's really gotten under people's skin. We're talking death threats against the senator who proposed it.
Death threats. Wow. Okay, so this deep dive is going to be pretty intense, I guess. Let's start with the basics, though. Before we even get into like the reactions and everything, what does this bill actually say?
Well, on the surface, it would make it illegal for men to, well, ejaculate without the intent to fertilize an embryo.
So basically, any sexual activity
Yeah.
that isn't specifically aimed at getting pregnant would be against the law.
That's basically the gist of it.
Yeah.
It's important to note, though, that there are exceptions for, sperm donation and contraceptive use.
Oh, okay. So not a total ban on male pleasure,
Yeah.
but still
Yeah.
fines, jail time. What are the actual consequences here?
Well, the bill proposes some pretty hefty fines. $1,000 for a first offense,
$1,000.
$5,000 for a second,
Oh, wow.
and $10,000 for each one after that.
Whoa.
No jail time, though.
Okay, well, that's good at least.
Mhm.
I have a feeling the people sending death threats didn't really read the whole thing, you know? But you mentioned this is satire, right? So what's the real point?
Right. Well, the senator who proposed it, Bradford Blackman, has been very upfront about the fact that he doesn't actually expect it to pass. It's more of a response to that Texas law, the one that allows people to sue anyone who helps someone get an abortion.
Ah, I see. So it's kind of a what if we did this to men situation.
Exactly. He's using satire to flip the script and make a point. The Texas law targets people who assist someone get an abortion, not just the person seeking one. So Senator Blackmun is sort of trying to highlight the double standard when it comes to, legislating men's and women's bodies.
Interesting. And it definitely worked in terms of getting people's attention, even if it's maybe not the kind of attention he wanted. But we are talking about Mississippi, which is one of the many states that have been pushing for stricter abortion laws, right? So even as satire, what does this bill tell us about the current political climate?
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this. It really just lays bare all the tension in this whole debate. I mean, Mississippi is one of 12 states that have implemented total or near total abortion bans.
Wow.
So you can see why even a satirical attempt to regulate male reproductive behavior is going to hit a nerve. It's a direct attack on some people's entire worldview.
So this bill is almost like a window into something much bigger and more complicated.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront some very basic questions about, like bodily autonomy and reproductive control. Like, who gets to make decisions about these deeply personal matters? That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And those aren't easy questions to answer. So I guess that's why we're seeing such strong reactions. And it's not just death threats, right? What are some of the other responses to the bill?
Well, it's been pretty widely condemned, with a lot of people using terms like vile and offensive. Even though it's satire, there's a feeling that it's, making light of a very serious issue.
So this bill has basically zero chance of becoming law.
You're right.
But it's still generating really strong emotions. Why is that?
It really shows how symbolic this whole issue is. I mean, even a gesture, even something as absurd as this bill, can be incredibly potent. It taps into people's deeply held beliefs and values about gender, reproduction, the role of government, all of that.
So Senator Blackmun may have been going for satire.
Yeah.
But he definitely hit a nerve. And I think that's where we need to dig a little deeper. What are those deeper issues this bill is bringing to the surface? Let's explore that right after this.
It's interesting to think about this bill in the context of the history of reproductive rights legislation. For decades, the focus has been almost exclusively on women.
Right, like access to birth control, abortion rights. It's all been framed as a women's issue.
Exactly. But this bill, even as a satirical gesture, kind of shifts the conversation in a pretty big way. It's almost like saying, hey, wait a minute, men are involved in reproduction too. Maybe we should be looking at their choices as well.
Yeah, it's a perspective that a lot of people feel has been missing from the conversation.
Absolutely. And it really opens up a whole bunch of questions. I mean, if we're going to make laws about reproductive behavior, should they only apply to women? What about men's responsibility and, unintended pregnancies? These are tough questions that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, for sure. And this bill, whether it was intentional or not, is forcing us to actually think about them.
It is. And I think that's one reason why it's getting such strong reactions. It's challenging those really deep societal norms and expectations. This bill makes people think about the roles of both men and women when it comes to reproduction, even if it seems outlandish.
And it also feels like it's playing into this bigger conversation happening right now about bodily autonomy. We've seen it with like vaccine mandates, debates about masks, and now, of course, with reproductive rights.
Absolutely. I mean, at the heart of all these debates is this fundamental question. Who gets to decide what happens to your body? Is it the individual, the government, or, some combination of both? It's about who defines the limits of that autonomy.
And when you're talking about reproduction, those lines get even blurrier. It's not just about one person's body anymore. There's another potential life involved.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complicated, both ethically and legally. And this Mississippi bill, while it is satire, it brings that complexity to the surface. It's like asking, even in a kind of joking way, should men be subject to the same level of, I don't know, scrutiny and regulation when it comes to their reproductive choices?
It's definitely clear that this Contraception Begins at Erection Act is a lot more than just a funny headline, right?
Right.
It's really tapped into something much deeper. And we're seeing all those anxieties and tensions play out in the reactions to the bill, both good and bad.
Yeah, I totally agree. This whole situation is kind of like a microcosm of the bigger cultural debates happening about gender roles, individual rights, all of that. And those debates are happening against this backdrop of very real anxieties about, well, the future of reproductive rights in this country.
And the death threats against Senator Blackmun, that really emphasizes how serious this all is.
For sure. It's a reminder that, while we might be talking about this bill in a kind of academic way, for a lot of people, these are very personal, very emotional issues with very real consequences.
Do you think that was Senator Blackmun's goal, though?
Mm-hmm.
To provoke this level of controversy?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure what his intentions were, but I think it's safe to say he wanted to do more than just, get people to laugh. He wanted to use humor to expose what he sees as hypocrisy, I guess. I think he wanted to show the unequal ways we treat women's bodies compared to men's.
And he's definitely done that,
Yeah.
at least to some degree. This bill is a national talking point now.
It is. And whether you agree with his method or not, he's gotten people talking. And in a political climate where these issues are often, silenced or twisted, I think that's valuable in itself.
But satire can be a powerful tool, but also kind of a risky one, don't you think? Was it the right approach here?
That's a tough question. Satire can be really effective at cutting through all the noise and showing how absurd something is. But it can also be misunderstood or backfire, especially in a time as divided as ours.
Right, someone could hear about this bill, miss the context, and just be totally outraged.
Exactly. And I think that's where we see the limits of satire when it comes to political change. It needs people to have a shared understanding, a certain level of, I guess, trust and good faith, which can be hard to find these days.
So even if it gets people's attention, satire isn't necessarily going to change minds or lead to real solutions.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Satire might be a good way to raise awareness or point out contradictions, maybe even make us laugh at how crazy things are. But if you want to find common ground or solutions, it usually needs to be combined with more nuanced ways of communicating.
So what does this mean for future debates about reproductive rights? What's the takeaway from this whole Contraception Begins at Erection Act situation?
I think it shows how badly we need more honest and open dialogue. We have to be willing to listen to and try to understand other perspectives, even when they make us uncomfortable.
Especially when these conversations are often dominated by the loudest voices on both sides.
Absolutely. We need to move past just yelling at each other and find ways to have respectful, thoughtful conversations, even when we disagree. Maybe especially when we disagree.
That's easier said than done, but it feels really important if we're ever going to find any common ground and make progress on these incredibly important issues.
I agree. It's not easy, but it's crucial. And I think this bill and the intense reactions to it showed just how much is at stake.
Okay, so we've talked about the bill as a whole, but what about the specific parts that have been the most controversial? What are the biggest points of disagreement here? This Mississippi bill, this Contraception Begins at Erection Act. It's been a fascinating deep dive, from the actual wording of the bill to the whole point of it to how people have reacted. There's so much to unpack.
There really is. And it's not just about this one law, like we've been talking about. It's like a tiny version of all these huge conversations we're having as a society right now, like about bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, what the government's role should be. Big, important questions.
And these questions aren't going away anytime soon. So where do we even go from here? What are the things you hope our listeners are really taking away from this?
I think it's a call to action. You know, we can't just sit back and watch these debates happen. We have to be part of them, even when it's tough. Educate yourself, listen to different perspectives, even the ones that make you uncomfortable, and don't be afraid to speak up about what you believe in.
Because staying silent won't change anything. It just lets things stay the same.
Exactly. Whether it's reproductive rights or anything else that matters to you, your voice matters. Get involved. Make yourself heard.
That's a good point. And it makes me think about the senator who kind of started all this. He used satire, which isn't exactly the usual approach, to bring attention to these issues. What do you think his legacy will be?
I think no matter what people think about this bill, he'll be remembered as someone who wasn't afraid to shake things up a bit. You know, to challenge how things are, even if it meant using humor to do it. His bill might never actually become law, but it's definitely started a conversation that's going to keep going even after people stop talking about this specific bill.
Like a spark that sets off something much bigger.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole thing, all the reactions to it shows us that people are thinking about this. They care. And I think that's something to be hopeful about, even with all the challenges.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at this Contraception Begins at Erection Act, talked about why it was written, how people have reacted, and how it all connects to the bigger debate about reproductive rights in the U.S.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting deep dive, and hopefully it'll leave our listeners with more questions than answers, you know? Because that's how we keep learning, keep growing, keep moving forward.
Sometimes the most important thing is to just keep asking the questions, keep the conversation alive.
Absolutely. Who knows? Maybe this, kind of crazy bill will be what finally leads to some real change.
Well, only time will tell. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on how things develop.
I think we all will. And we hope our listeners will too. Stay informed, stay involved, and keep thinking critically.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, stay curious.